Tervetuloa tähän Suomalaisuuden Liiton järjestämään tilaisuuteen. Tilaisuuden aiheena on englantilaisen sosiologi Frank Furedin itse asiassa aika hiljattain englanniksi julkaistu teos, joka nyt on käännetty suomen kielelle. Suomenkielinen teoksen nimi on Rajat merkitsevät. Meillä on suuri ilo ja kunnia saada tänne paikalle kirjan kirjoittaja, kirjan tekijä, professori emeritus Frank Furedi. Welcome. Tervetuloa, Frank Furedi. Furedi on tutkija, yhteiskunnallinen keskustelija ja hyvin tuottelias kirjoittaja. Hän on julkaissut yli 25 kirjaa yhteiskunnallisesti tärkeistä teemoista, kuten auktoriteetti, arvovalta, populismi, identiteetti, terapiakulttuuri ja vanhemmuus. Nyt suomeksi julkaistu Furedin teos ilmestyi Englannissa viime vuonna. Teos, jonka suomenkielen nimi on siis Rajat merkitsevät, yhteisö, rajat ja arvottaminen, on siis jo, se alkuteos on varsin tuore. Näin Liitto jatkaa meidän julkaisutoimintaa, jossa me nostetaan esiin suomalaisessa julkisuudessa vähemmän käsiteltyjä tai suorastaan laiminlyötyjä teemoja. Furedin teos syventää yhteiskuntatieteelliseltä kannalta vuonna 2020 julkaisemamme englantilaisen filosofi Roger Scrutonin teoksen Kansakuntaa tarvitaan -sanomaa. Tässä tilaisuudessa keskustellaan teoksen esiin nostamista kysymyksistä. Keskusteluun osallistuvat perussuomalaisten puheenjohtaja, kansanedustaja Riikka Purra, kokoomuksen kansanedustaja Atte Kaleva ja keskustan kansanedustaja Hilkka Kemppi. Keskustelun juontaa toimittaja Ivan Puopolo. Tervetuloa keskustelijat ja juontaja. Mutta ensin professori Frank Furedi kertoo kirjastaan englanniksi. Please, Professor Furedi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I always think that Finland, more than anywhere else in the world, understands the importance of borders. Given your history and the fact that being Finnish throughout the last 200-300 years has always been a result of struggles to maintain and defend your borders, in the 21st century, this is even more important. You know, I always remember when I was giving a lecture in New York, and we're talking about borders, about Europe, and the other academics were saying, you know, Frank, we live in a world that's globalized. Everything is globalized. Nothing matters but the global sphere. And the nation states do not matter anymore. And when I said, I still think the nations are important, they looked at me as I was an idiot, you know, this poor, uneducated idiot who thinks that the nation and the nation state still matters in a globalized world. And what they were really saying is that national governments have got no influence, the problems that we face are totally global, and therefore you might as well, it doesn't matter whether you're Finnish or Hungarian or French, these things are old, not part of the 21st century. That was before COVID. Because the minute that COVID kicked in and people wanted vaccinations, where did they have to get vaccinations from? Who was going to protect them? Well, it turned out that none of the international globalist organizations were of any help. The European Union was paralyzed. It was sitting on its rear end looking at its shoelaces. No vaccination came from Brussels. The World Health Organization gave very big speeches and talked about the health problem, but they had no idea of how to give you vaccines. People who got vaccines got them because their governments, their national governments, made sure that they kept their people healthy. So it wasn't globalism that provided the solutions. It was nationally based pharmaceutical companies, and it was national governments. And then I always remember that the same people who said borders are not important, we live in a globalized world, they also said, you know, Frank, in the 21st century, we no longer have wars in Europe. You know, wars are 19th century. And there's even books, if you look on Amazon, there are books that says wars have become obsolete. You know, wars only occur in Iraq or in Libya or in Africa, but no, Europe, no more wars. And in fact, you probably know, the European Union got a Nobel Peace Prize, or was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, because the European Union guaranteed that there will be no more wars in Europe. But that was a magical thinking. That was very much a magical thinking of the globalist imagination, because we now know, after Ukraine, that wars can happen in Europe. And not only can happen in Europe, if you are a responsible citizen, a responsible government, you have to make sure that you prepare for the possibility of protecting your borders. And although in university seminars you can say borders do not matter, the people of Ukraine believe that it does matter. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so fiercely defending their borders. So I think this is important for us to realize that these issues are just as important now as they were when you defended yourself in the Winter War against the Russians back in 1939, and then later on when you were faced with those kinds of threats. Unfortunately, those issues are still very much with us in the 21st century. So the question that I was very much interested in is, why is it that it's become so popular in the Western media and in Western culture to call for open borders? Why is it that people say that borders are bad? They're by definition bad. And when I began to look at it, I realized that it wasn't simply that national borders were being questioned. That was bad enough. But in fact, any borders, any boundary that has any kind of moral or cultural link with the past were being questioned. You know, one of the interesting things in Anglo-American culture is that we now argue that there should be no boundary between children and adults. Children are just little adults. And they tell you, you know, Frank, you're so old-fashioned because there's so much you can learn from your children. And your children's wisdom is of such quality that there's no point making this kind of distinction. And if you look at Anglo-American parents, many of them, you know, are so infantilized that they try to behave like very cool teenagers. You know, we have this phenomenon in England when a mother goes shopping with her daughter, it's the daughter that tells the mother what to buy, what clothes to buy, rather than the other way around. And I remember being in New York in Central Park, and there are all these T-shirts saying, "I'm done with adulting." In other words, I don't want to be an adult, I want to just be a cool kid. And that kind of erosion of that line has been really, really deeply entrenched. But it's not just that. Look at the way the distinction between man and woman has been called into question. It's artificial, Frank. You don't understand. You know, these biological distinctions are not really important. And you then ask the question, well, what's happening to our world? Why is it, for example, that today, when we have a leadership competition in England for the head of the Conservative Party, one of the main candidates, Penny Mordaunt, who's probably going to become either the leader or will come in second, argues that women can have penises, that you gotta be stupid to imagine that only a man can have that kind of organ, because the distinction between man and woman is much more nuanced. So you got this gender-neutral ideology that suggests that this line is very old-fashioned and is out of date. And I could go on and on and on. You have a very disturbing development occurring in our society, where it's being suggested that the boundary between animals and human beings is artificial, that animals can have conscience just like human beings. In fact, I went to a discussion where people were debating whether animals can give consent to a sexual act. They were seriously discussing that. They weren't joking. They actually believed that somehow an animal can do that just like a human being can. And there's this kind of completely disturbed sensibility that finds it difficult to hold any line, including, very importantly, the distinction between private and public. And I could go on and give you loads of illustrations, loads of examples where the boundary has been really significantly undermined and is being culturally institutionalized. And it seems to me that there are a number of reasons why this is occurring. And the most important reason for this is because we now argue increasingly that it is wrong to judge. We shouldn't be judging each other. We should be non-judgmental. And of course, when you say that judging is a bad thing, what you're really saying is that actually we cannot take each other so seriously that I can tell you that you're wrong or you're right. We should somehow take a step backwards. What does that mean? If we now argue that judgment is wrong, then what you're actually saying, and this is what underpins all these illustrations, is that that we cannot make any moral distinctions between right and wrong. We can no longer make a moral distinction between good and bad. To do that is to be totalitarian, is to be judgy. But if it is the case that it's wrong to judge and say you're wrong, and it's wrong to say you're right, it's wrong to say that's evil and bad, if that's really the case, then what are we teaching to our children? What does a mother or father do when they talk to a 4-, 5-, 6-year-old child? What are the ideals that you're kind of transmitting to them? And I think one of the consequences of this inability to make moral judgments, to leave that behind, is that we end up disappointing and failing the younger generations. We have a situation where younger generations, young people, through no fault of their own, end up morally deprived of the cultural legacy of humanity, in a sense, and are developing in such a way that they're very, very unclear about which road to take, because the adult world refuses to guide them or inspire them or give them the intellectual moral resources so they can make up their own mind and know which road they must go down upon and where they should be. I think the key issue from a political point of view, and because I know there are parliamentarians here, I think the key political issue for us in terms of borders has got to do with the fact that borders are the medium through which democracy and freedom can be exercised. Without borders, there is no such thing as a citizen. Without borders, we don't have a community where you and I become responsible for each other. Without borders, we don't have a situation where we can understand what our duties are to each other. And you cannot have democracy unless the people that are voting have got some kind of commitment to the geographical space that they inhabit, where because they have the same geographical space, they also come to an agreement of what kind of life they think is good for them. So borders are really quite important, and I think it's important to realize that the very word for the law, which is part and parcel of democracy, in the old ancient Greek times, when they developed the idea of democracy, the word for the law was the same as the wall. The walls that surrounded a city-state were the legal foundation for democratic decision-making. You know, people will tell you that democracy can be a global democracy, that every human being is the same. But that's not true. We all have a moral obligation towards every member of humanity, but we have differential obligations towards our members of our family, towards our neighbors, and towards the people that share our community. And that obligation, which we have towards each other and members of our community, is the resource, is the moral basis on which democratic decision-making takes place. You get rid of borders, and that's the end of democracy. When it's the end of democracy, that's the end of our freedom. And that's why we have to fight to maintain it and develop it and make sure that future generations take it seriously. Thank you.